Hey everybody, this is Dr. John back with the latest episode of the Evolved Caveman. And from the book, Reinventing Masculinity, in a recent 538 poll, 60% of men surveyed said society puts pressure on men to behave in a way that is unhealthy or bad. Men account for 80% of suicides in the US, and 3 in 10 American men have suffered from depression. Ed Adams and Ed Frauenheim say a big part of the problem is a model of masculinity that's become outmoded and even dangerous to both men and women. The conventional notion of what it means to be a man, what Adams and Frauenheim called confined masculinity, traps men in an emotional straitjacket, steers them towards selfishness, misogyny, and violence, and severely limits their possibilities. As an antidote, they propose a new paradigm, liberating masculinity, building on traditional masculine roles like the protector and provider, expanding men's options to include caring, collaboration, emotional expressivity, an inclusive spirit, and environmental stewardship. So today I am thrilled to have with me Ed Frauenheim. Ed was Senior Director of Content at Great Place to Work, the research organization behind Fortune's 100 Best Companies to Work For list. And he has written or co-written articles for Fortune, Inc., and Wired, and is the co-author of 3 books. Ed, how are you doing? I'm thrilled to have you here.
I'm doing well, John. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, we met recently, and for those of you listening, I professed my love to Ed quite quickly for me, within minutes. It was very odd and liberating. So Ed, tell us your story. Like, how did you get to the point of writing a book on reinventing masculinity?
Sure, John. My story is one of struggling to be a guy in a lot of ways. And I need to put that caveat on these days, which I want to put on, that I had it in a lot of ways pretty easy growing up. I was a middle-class white guy, cisgender, heterosexual, growing up in a suburb outside of Buffalo, New York, and still faced all these pressures that a lot of us guys had growing up. I'm 55 now, to be, great at sports, super strong, ladies' man, win in different areas of life, and also to be, that tough guy, super stoic. I was skinny, I was sensitive, insecure, and I was thwarted with all my sports championship games. I tied in a hockey game when I was 12, and I felt like I was the one who, cost the team a win. I didn't win my college intramurals championships in hockey or in ultimate frisbee. And then my teams were losing like crazy. The Buffalo Bills lost 4 Super Bowls in a row, John. And the Knicks couldn't get past the Bulls. All that, it sounds trivial, but it all kind of weighed on me, and I know that there's been some other writing about people and these adolescent moments that can be really powerful. That was powerful for me. And as I got into the career stage, I did fine. I'm a writer, a lot of books, as you mentioned, and, made a middle-class living, but I never managed anyone I managed one person for one day. I may have the smallest management career in history. And I never got, to the Pulitzer Prize level of articles and that sort of thing as a journalist. And all that to say, I found a way to feel more whole as I reflected on these masculine pressures we face. That ultimately, through personal writing, and then also seeing that in the workplace where I studied work issues and leadership, I saw men are called to show up differently. It's not successful to be that barking boss, that kind of cold, me first guy anymore. And that's how, when Ed and I talk about like 2 Eds being better than 1, and he brought the psychological perspective, which I know you have, John, and then I brought the workplace perspective, and we both had these personal stories, and that's what led us to our book, Reinventing Masculinity. And it's been neat to see that it's making some kind of an impact on folks and giving guys permission to think more broadly about how to be a guy.
Yeah, and I love those of us out there that are giving men permission to be full spectrum, to embrace their full spectrum humanity. Like, I think I like the idea that we're human before we're male. And, like, we feel things, even though we don't want to.
Yes, we do. Exactly.
So God, there's a bunch of ways I can go with this. So one of the things I wanted to touch on was your time at Great Places to Work.
Mm-hmm.
And what did you see in terms of, because you mentioned kind of what I consider command and control style leadership, the traditional style leadership. It's kind of paramilitary, it's hierarchical, it's fear driven, intimidation driven. what did you see in terms of great places to work and any correlation to that type of leadership?
We saw that the opposite almost type of leadership is what's succeeding today. We did a study a couple years ago looking at 75,000 employees and 10,000 managers.
Wow.
And we found that the most productive and inclusive leaders were what we ended up calling for all leaders. And that was a reference to the fact that almost everyone on their teams had a great experience. They also had the highest levels of innovation, productivity, retention, all these kind of markers for what you want on business results. And what these folks looked like were qualities that do not show up in that kind of old style leadership, command and control stuff. Instead, these are folks that built bonds of trust. They were really great relationship developers. They were purpose oriented. By that, I mean the big picture purpose, not necessarily the quarterly results, but what is the highest mission of our organization? They also were humble. They tended to make space for their people to show up and get the attention and to not take credit for the accomplishments of their teams. And so when we created an icon for this, John, that I loved. It was a woman. So it was a woman sitting down with her hand holding a rainbow. And it was like the exact opposite of that take charge guy who's maybe like barking an order. Like the rainbow was kind of reflecting the idea of what's the purpose, the gold we're seeking at the end of the rainbow. And in fact, they did get the gold, because that's what people are drawn to now, is that kind of warm leader, the psychologically safe oriented leader, the leader that's going to be about purpose.
Well, we know that from the Google study that psychological safety is the #1 driver of effective teams.
Exactly. Yeah. And that we had very similar findings. We found that the most the small businesses that had a caring community outpaced the revenue of their peers. And at first, I had to fight to get that research published, John, because at Great Place to Work, we even weren't sure we could say that because it sounded so soft, and but this is what the numbers showed. Like we're dealing with hundreds of companies and data points, and that was the most significant driver of revenue outperformance, was whether people felt like they were in a caring community.
Well, I think, at some level, we all want to be seen, heard, and validated, and we all want to feel safe. And, if you think of psychological safety driving productivity, what's the #1 thing that undermines safety, psychological safety? I would say it's negative emotions, primarily anger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A line that we used in our book, I think, was caring rather than scaring produces the best results today.
Yeah.
And that requires guys to show up differently. Whereas before, even if they weren't scaring people, still guys tended to have kind of their armor up, right? And
oh yeah,
not going to be vulnerable, and you never can cry. But if you're going to create psychological safety as a leader, you've got to go first. Mm-hmm. You've got to be the one who said, I'm actually struggling today because I had a big tax surprise, and I'm worried about
my. You got to give permission.
You got to give permission.
You got to model that.
Exactly. And so if guys are showing up that older way, they come across as rigid, cold, and isolated in a world that's really now calling for flexibility, warmth, and connection.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's one of my biggest struggles as a coach is some of these old command and control style CEOs that, for any number of reasons, just can't seem to see the damage they're creating in their workforce.
What do you think is behind that? That's a fascinating observation. Well, there's blindness there.
I think lack of self-awareness is the foundation. I'm a big fan of Tasha Urich's work that says 95% of us will self-report being highly self-aware, and the actual number seems to be somewhere between 10 and 15%.
Wow. All right. I didn't know that statistic.
And I think a lot of
I got to check my own reference points there.
Okay.
I call myself self-aware. I might not be in that category.
Yeah. Well, then you hear that and you're like, oh shit, where am I? Which am I?
Right.
And it doesn't really matter where you start. It just matters that you become aware and start working on it to get better at it. And I think, one of the big problems is that whole man box socialization process, where I would argue we're left with only 3 things that we can publicly display without fear of humiliation, which are lust, stress, and the big one, anger. And so all of our emotions almost get funneled through that anger lens. And I would say a big part of these CEOs that's motivating them is abject fear and terror. but it comes out as anger and irritability.
Mm-hmm.
They're so scared of not achieving or not living up to what they think they should be doing, or letting people down, or letting the investors down, whatever it is, letting their dads down. Dad was an owner before them.
Yeah.
And it just comes out as this awful irritability and anger, where they're just barking at people and creating psychological terror, intimidation, fear, anxiety, stress, stifling creativity and innovation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're really onto it when you talk about those three sanctioned expressions or emotions, and all the ones that aren't. Because I posit something similar to what you said about why aren't these guys seeing the impact, and I was thinking it has something to do with not knowing what those feelings are themselves,
Right.
because they don't let themselves feel, oh my God, I feel like a little bit empty, or I feel sad that I'm not making a better difference in the world, say, or frustrated that something isn't working, or even joy, the other flip side of like the beauty of stuff, or the beauty of teamwork. Yeah. I've been playing around with a little phrase of like, I want to help guys feel, reveal, and heal, because I think there's so much that is not felt.
Yeah.
And I'm still working on this, even though I know what the medicine is supposed to be, but it's still hard to let the guard down.
Well, and I think it's still scary at times. It is for me. I'm still working on it. I've been working on it for 30 plus years. But I think, with that anger, I think we're really addicted to anger as men in positions of power in particular. Yeah. And the problem with anger is I externalize all blame onto you when I'm really angry at you. And so if I'm doing that, I have no accountability. I have nothing I need to look at myself. If you would just stop being such a lazy sack of whatever, I wouldn't be so angry. Then I'd be okay.
Yeah.
Instead of, what's my part in this drama? What am I doing to contribute? What is this? It's a co-creation.
Yeah.
What's my responsibility?
I love that, John. And I'll cop to, I went to an anger management class maybe 5-7 years ago. It's because I was trying to get my daughter to go to an anger management class. She's like, Dad, you have a bad temper. You should go. I'm like, okay, fine. I will go. I was trying to role model that. And I actually learned so much.
I think we should all go to one.
I was in this class at Kaiser Permanente, my healthcare system, with a really diverse group of people, some folks that are dealing with jail issues, I think I heard you talk about this with Alex on one of your other podcasts, like anger as a cover for either sadness or fear. Maybe there's other stuff in there too.
Guilt, but shame, embarrassment.
That what I really took away is, like, so often for me, at least, anger was about fearing for the safety of my kids, or it was that I was just sad, and I couldn't register that emotion really well.
Yeah. And so I think, to your question of why do they do that, I think that's part of it. I think there's other little things around the edges, but I think to me, that's some of the biggest explanation.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this, going back to great places to work. One of the things you spoke of when we spoke earlier in our first conversation is this idea of different sort of colored levels being applied to human consciousness, a la Ken Wilber, but then you guys applied those to organizations. Can you go into that a little bit? Because that was fascinating to me.
Yeah, thanks for that invitation.
Because I can't even understand Ken Wilber.
I have not made it through a ton of his stuff, but I do appreciate some of the overall theories. And then the author that really moved me and applied a lot of Wilber's theories is named Frederick Laloux, and he wrote a book called Reinventing Organizations. And he talked about how we're at this next stage of human consciousness called teal consciousness, and organizations are taking this form. So we talk about teal organizations, and that teal is a color that comes after a progression of colors that correspond to human levels of basically awareness. Starting with red, which is a very kind of angry gang type warfare stuff, and then
see, there you go, red, anger at the bottom.
There you go. It almost fits your colors from inside out, John.
Yes.
But amber is like more authoritarian, like a church or a university that's very structured and rigid. Then comes orange, which is a more kind of capitalistic or focused on performance and achievement, innovation. Green is kind of the DEI world of, okay, well, let's actually include more voices. But the teal one is shaped by kind of an acceptance of all the other levels for one thing. And you really could call it leading to soulful organizations where we're allowed to bring our whole person and to see the world in a more holistic connection. They also are characterized by democracy and much more shared decision making and an evolving sense of purpose, so that you're listening to like the spirit of the organization. So it can sound a little woo-woo, but I found that I was really drawn to this, and in part because Lalou talks about the need to unite the feminine and masculine energies and archetypes, and that we, for 10,000 years, maybe since the dawn of agriculture, have leaned on a hyper-masculine side of things, where we're ignoring the connectivity, the compassion, the receptivity, just the being, as opposed to the doing and the kind of aggressive and purposefulness of masculinity, which can be fine in balance, but we've been out of balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that explanation, because it's one of the things I argue for, is the marrying of masculine and feminine energies. And to me, it's really about, like, because I get guys push back on that, right? They're like, well, I don't want to be feminine, like I want to be a man, and their fear comes up, and I get that. And I'm like, and I actually had someone ask me in an interview, like, well, it seems to me like you're arguing for the wussification of men. Like, you haven't been listening.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I'm arguing for is to give men full access to their complete humanity, whether it's masculine or feminine. If we can just kind of throw those labels out, that'd be great. And just let them be human, and then bring the best parts of themselves to whatever the context is that they're in. So different context, different needs. If you're playing rugby versus going out on date night with your partner versus, helping a child with a skinned knee.
Love that, John. Yeah. One way that I've come to think about this, and I've got a partner who thought up this with me, Jim Young, we came up with this idea of the arrow and circle man, which I think gets to what you're saying, like it's harmonizing the feminine and the masculine, and it's right there in the masculine bathroom symbol, the symbol of Mars with the arrow pointing up to the right, the circle. And like, we've been only about the arrow for thousands of years, and we ignored this other part of our humanity, as you're pointing out, like the need to be caring and to connect. And when you talk about the wussification of men, like it takes real courage to talk about emotions and to be vulnerable. Which Brene Brown has spoken so well of.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of courage to be willing to opt out of some of the domination games that men play, and to sort of stand up for, the least powerful around, and to sort of stop a bully, say, as opposed to just go along with this idea we're going to be, king of the castle and make fun of those who haven't gotten to the top. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of simplistic thinking around this question of how do we evolve as men. And I like the way you're talking about, can we access our full humanity? Because there's so much richness there, John, right? Like when you just have the arrow, you often don't have an interior life.
Right.
You often are also going to be disconnected from people. You don't have as many friends. That we now know with growing amounts of research, that relationships are the key issue, the key factor for a healthy and happy life. Yep. So you're going to be a non-wussy man and be a dead man and an unhappy man. You're going to choose that because you're afraid of being a wuss. Yeah.
The masculine code ensures your misery.
That's brilliant right there.
I mean, truly, I think, and then that's the thing that it pisses me off about this, honestly, because I see so many men that are fucking miserable, and they have it all, but they have no friends. They can't communicate with their wife. Their teenage kids are resentful and angry at them because all their time and attention is spent at work.
Yeah.
But they're worth $400 million.
Wow.
And that frustrates me.
Do you see change and hope? And I love to, I got my thought on it too, but I'm curious, when you look out of the culture, John, or especially with younger men, what do you see?
I see reason for hope. I see the younger generation in high schools and colleges. I mean, I think it's split, right? I can argue it either way, but the part I like to focus on is there's a large group of young men that are more and more or increasingly comfortable with everything that they feel. They understand that the importance of having friendships and a healthy relationship with a partner. They're comfortable telling each other male friends, I love you, giving them hugs. And then I see, I mean, it's funny because it's spotty, right? I remember a few years ago, I had a teenager telling me that, yeah, I was trying to be vulnerable in front of my girlfriend, and I started crying because it was kind of heavy. And she looks at me and she goes, dude, stop being such a pussy. And so I think just that awareness of, it's not just the men policing the men,
Right.
it's women are raised in this environment too, and they buy into it as well.
For sure. Yeah, that's a huge issue. And we try to, in our book, acknowledge that like this is men's responsibility to change, but women can play a huge role in facilitating it or preventing it. If not preventing it, hindering it, let's say.
Yeah. When I like the idea that I like the idea that it's not our fault that we came up through the man box. That just happens. We don't ask for it. We never chose it, but it is our responsibility to evolve beyond it. And I think one of the things that we can do and women can do, and I'm kind of generalizing here for heterosexual relationships, so I apologize, is I think we can both realize that women are inherently better in most cases in relationship than we are, because we are not socialized in that direction at all growing up. In fact, I would argue that we're mocked and humiliated most of the time for dipping our toe in those waters. And women are socialized in the direction of relationship, connection, nurturing. And so I think oftentimes, like when I'm doing couples counseling, I'm giving more weight to what the female's saying and her perception of reality, because I know that typically the man is locked in anger and is externalizing most of the blame.
Interesting.
And isn't as evolved in those soft skills that she is.
Yeah, and if I apply that to the workplace realm, which I know better than that, the personal realm where you have such expertise in, as my co-author does, that's what you just described helps explain why women are thriving as leaders when they do get to be leaders, because they have that wider range. They've had to learn the game of being the hypermasculine boss and be tough, but they also tend to still have those relationship skills, or often do still. And they're able to work in this world that's more flatter, faster, and more fairness focused is another way I've kind of thought about where things are going. And that often requires a little bit of vulnerability. It requires a emotional intelligence to be able to read emotions and know how to respond. And if guys want to thrive in the world that's taking shape, they do need to get those soft skills. And maybe we can reframe them as success skills. My co-author's wife, Marilee Adams, helped us coin that little term, but because that's really what's called for these days.
And I think we need to consider marketing, in the use of phrases, right? Like maybe we call those skills rock hard cock skills. I'm just trying to think of how do you appeal to the man box man. I'm half kidding.
Yeah.
Where was I going with that shit? Oh, I think you're right that I think women are better suited to be leaders at this point because they have more access to a broader suite of skills. And I think there's a distinction I make between gender and sex, where gender is masculine to feminine and that spectrum, and sex is male to female and that spectrum. So what that means is, especially for a lot of women in business, they've learned to be more masculine because they need that to survive. They need those skills, but then they also have access to the feminine. And so you can have a masculine woman or a feminine man or anywhere in between. But I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It seems to me that we are starting to realize, more and more people I think are realizing that, this is going back to that hope question. And I see it in some of the best workplace leaders that I, got to write about and interview and connect with. Like the head of Cisco, for example, is Chuck Robbins. And, he just embraced some of these things that we would consider more feminine. When he took over as the CEO role several years ago, he had a dream that he was in a homelessness camp in San Jose, near Silicon Valley headquarters of Cisco, the big tech company. And in the camp, he saw in the dream the face of his father and his pastor. And the next morning he woke up and said, like, I just have to do something about this. And he called, the city officials in charge of homelessness issues and said, well, how can we help? And so he immediately made sort of philanthropy a key part of his leadership, which has typically been more, we just tell us about the bottom line, and that all that do-gooder stuff, not part of the, real performance, right? Plus he was leaning into the intuitive, the
Spiritual,
soul,
yeah,
dreams, right? And for him to take that seriously and to be public about it, it kind of ignited a firestorm of philanthropy and throughout the company, so that the entire company, all the employees started doing more, and their efforts just kept like a flywheel of effect of feeling better about themselves, and as a company, they rose in the Great Place to Work rankings in the course of this work. So there are leaders doing that. Another example is the head of PwC, the consulting firm and accounting firm. He took a call during the COVID time frame in his daughter's bedroom. So, a lot of leaders were having to kind of lean into their humanity, but he's like, okay, I'm on a Zoom call. I'm in my daughter's bedroom. And during the call, he acknowledged that mental health challenges had touched his family. And for this leader of one of 55,000 employee or something like this, company in charge of money issues, to acknowledge vulnerability in his own household around mental health, that just is speaking volumes of the way that guys are cracking open or breaking out of that man box we call confined masculinity, and sort of acknowledging the fuller humanity.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was just doing an interview this morning, actually, with Dr. Elise Cortez, who does meaning. She brings meaning and purpose into corporations. And she was saying that, in leaders, she's looking at intelligence, emotional intelligence, pretty standard. And then she also has added spiritual intelligence. And she said, a lot of these high performing, innovative companies, the leaders have really embraced these spiritual elements. And to me, that makes sense, right? That CEOs or leaders are always operating in an imperfect vacuum of information. Like you can't get enough. You don't have perfect information in order to make a decision.
Yeah.
So you're always kind of trying to gather as much information as you can and then make a calculated risk decision. And okay, so you're going to check an astrological reading, or you're going to check a dream. I mean, I think it's whatever avenue you can use to get another little nugget of information that might apply. And I thought that was kind of interesting.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's a growing area, and that's one of the reasons I've been drawn to this teal stuff. And to be clear, like, the teal world is a little separate from the Great Place to Work world. A lot of my research when I was there was heading in that direction, but Great Place to Work is not quite embracing this teal stuff. I think it's a step away, you might say. But that's actually why I did leave Great Place to Work. It was a great place to work, but it wasn't quite ready to embrace this stuff. Partly, I think, of that fear of the woo-woo, maybe, but also I think it's a little more comfortable with some of the traditional reporting structures, whereas teal is really interested in shared decision making and distributed power, really challenging these traditional hierarchies. So, but going back to your point about the spiritual knowledge piece, I think you're right, and I think there's the latest science suggests that, like, when we achieve states like meditation, like you were getting at earlier, John, like, we have access to understandings and insights that we wouldn't otherwise have. So why wouldn't we tap that world and that element of ourselves, and then the deeper connections we have to the collective unconscious, as Jung might put it, or other
quantum intelligence, or however you want to. Yeah,
exactly. It's there. We may not understand it fully, but including with all the research on psychedelics and their ways of people accessing deep, like, firm beliefs that we've seen the deeper connections. Like, there's something going on there that we can tap.
Yeah, and I mean, I've lived long enough. I'm a big fan of the scientific paradigm, and I also have lived long enough to know that it can't explain everything. It's one paradigm.
Yeah.
And I'm always going back to that. That's my foundation. But I've also lived long enough to realize that there's more going on in this world, and there's other paradigms to explore that might address other phenomenon a little bit better.
Yep, for sure. I think that the more we step into these practices of contemplation, of meditation, explorations with some of the psychedelics, and how they can be therapeutic, besides expansive. I'm reading Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, right now. And I know some
Great
friends
book.
that have gone on some of these medicine trips, and they've been incredible, like super powerful in terms of transforming lifelong anxiety and giving people a lot more hope. I'm considering doing some of this work as well, and taking some of these medicinal trips, both for anxiety that I've wrestled with, but also because I'm drawn to that spiritual access. And this is another thing that men historically wall themselves off from, John. Like the research shows, men are a lot less interested in spirituality, or so at least somewhat less interested in spirituality than women are. And so what an impoverished life that is if you are going to just poo-poo that and focus on the material your entire life.
Yeah, there's definitely more going on in this world than what I can sense with my five senses. That's for damn sure.
Yeah.
In fact, my eyes don't even work that well anymore, so I'm maybe down to 4.5 senses.
Oh no! All right, I'm sorry to hear that, and maybe some other, the intuitive or the other kinds of senses may take off.
Exactly. I mean, my thought is, okay, what am I not seeing, or what am I supposed to see differently? So that's how I'm trying to make meaning of it. But so turning to masculinity, because I want to get to your book a little bit as well. So how do you talk about traditional masculinity? Because that's kind of a perilous phrase in this day and age.
Yeah.
And I sure as hell don't want to go to toxic masculinity, because I don't think that helps any of us.
We had the same idea, John. We're trying to understand what's the terminology we're going to use as we think about the shift underway. And we did sort of see try to keep things simple. The notion of the conventional traditional masculinity, we ended up calling it confined masculinity, which is similar to that box idea. And it really stemmed from some psychological theories that came out of a Japanese psychologist who talked about the confined and the expanded self. And I'm not going to get the psychologist's name right at the moment, but it was the confined self was an unhealthy version of the self, and the expanded one had much more vitality, and it was a fuller life. We didn't want to have expanded masculinity because we felt it sounded too much like an erection, so we went for liberating masculinity.
Bad, Ed?
That kind of, we were heading down that path pretty long, John. Like, well, we went with liberating masculinity to signal that it's about a freeing of yourself. Can
I jump in there though, in terms of confined or restrictive masculinity? I like those phrases, and it makes me think of, if you take a piece of paper and you fold it many times, it has that feeling to it, like a confined definition of self. And it's in each of those folds in which the shadow, the shame, the guilt, the fear, the anger lie.
I love that. Did you just come up with that just now, the folded paper?
I did.
All right, I'm taking this weird paper. There it is. Here we are. That's a brilliant analogy. And our book in some ways came out of the APA new guidelines on healthy masculinity.
It created a huge firestorm.
Big firestorm. And Ed Adams, my co-author, was on the front lines of that. He was on he was on Today, some of the morning shows with Michael Strahan, for example, and Laura Ingraham on Fox, because the findings of those were like, if men adhere rigidly to those traditional guidelines of stoicism, competitiveness, aggression, self-reliance, they live unhealthy lives. They have higher rates of the problems, like the medical problems, and shorter lifespans,
suicide, addiction, loneliness, all
that stuff. And so it shouldn't be in some ways controversial, right? But we got that big backlash, but that's where we were. That was a big genesis for our book, was to say, how can we get to a healthier place? And it's not just the realm of our own health, but we tie things to the planet. Like, if we don't have a more enlightened version of masculinity that sees the interdependence of the world, we are going to burn ourselves up or blow ourselves up.
When you can argue that traditional masculinity looks at women just as they do the planet. You dominate, you take what you want. You don't worry about the consequences.
That is really well put. Yeah, exactly. And then, that is actually a road into, I think, a better version of masculinity too, is to point out, like, do you really want to have your wife or your daughter or your mother treated in that way? And there can be a defense of the traditional thing, I'm going to protect her and so forth. But if you kind of push a little bit further, they're like, do you really want to treat them like they are infants as opposed to adults like you and me? Like, why should they have less power? You know how powerful they are. They're probably more powerful than you in some ways, So I think there's an avenue there. But I think a big part of it is helping guys see that traditional masculinity and just asking them, how is it serving you? You talked with Alex the other day.
Terranova, yeah.
With a beautiful conversation about men talking about the pressures they felt. What was hardest about being a man? And Alex talked about a hike where they were saying it's just so hard to be a provider and to be a successful guy. And I think if we raise more of these conversations, I've been having them with my friends and wider circles as well. And so often men don't really understand what they are called to do individually. We those pressures of how we're supposed to show up as that money guy and the strong man and the ladies man, that really gets in the way of us being who we would be otherwise naturally or organically, or in terms of what our spirit is called to be.
Yeah. I think it hamstrings us on a number of levels. And, the biggest ones I'm concerned about is happiness and relational satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
Because we seem to be doing okay in, the workplace, like we can make money, but, again, we don't find a whole lot of meaning in it usually. And we lack self-awareness, so we don't really know what we feel.
Yeah, and I want to challenge that a little bit, John, because yes, guys have done better than women overall in the workplace, but most people at work, including most men, are not satisfied, or they're disengaged, right?
Yeah.
And they are.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like the Gallup information.
Yes, the Gallup information
absolutely.
on disengagement, and what you find is that those workplaces are structured according to a hyper-masculine culture.
Yeah.
There, as we've been talking about, the command and control stuff, there's no room for emotion or intuition or spirit. And that kind of infantilization of those in the lower rungs of the organization, which is most guys, most people, is very toxic, to the point where it shaves years off our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff Pfeffer of Stanford has done this amazing research on how we have like 100,000, 120,000 extra deaths a year because of this kind of management where people they don't have any control over their jobs at work. They have insecurity over their jobs at work, with this kind of ruthless kind of layoffs at the slightest drop of trouble, and slightest sign of trouble will lay people off, and so all this contributes to a pretty unhealthy experience at work for most guys. Yeah. Even though, to your point, I mean, maybe you were getting at this idea that, well, we can earn a living and we can maybe do better than women have. It's far from ideal.
Yeah, I think you nailed it with your first statement of we're doing better than women, was kind of my thought.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously that's true with the pay gap. And so, yeah, where do you see us evolving? I mean, you kind of touched on that. Where specifically how, and I know it's hard to be prescriptive, but
mm-hmm.
What are the general trends, I guess?
I think that the role, for one thing, we think about roles and relationships that are sanctioned under that confined masculinity, and I think where we're going with this liberating masculinity or this Erewhon circle masculinity. I think men are seeing that they can be caregivers. In addition, in some of the roles they can be are caregivers. That can mean raising kids more actively. And there's really neat research that men during the pandemic who are staying at home more have identified more fully as dads, when they are dads, and they don't want to go back. They've really kind of, fused that into their identity. Who wouldn't? I mean, they're their kids, and they're coming to realize, I love you, and it's challenging, but there is a change in identity that's happened during the pandemic because of the work at home. So caregiving, but also things like spiritual seeker, like we were getting at a little bit earlier. Like, can you make space for exploring the matters of spirit and soul? Potentially also the new kinds of relationships that we can get into, so that we can be relating to each other as from a place of emotional vulnerability, and face-to-face male friends as opposed to shoulder to shoulder, so that we can actually look at each other in the eye, really understand how we're doing and be honest about that stuff, including, warts and all. So that includes a closer relationship to ourselves. It's like, who am I? What am I really feeling? The self-awareness piece that you're getting. So I think one way to think about it is this: we have more roles that we can play, and we have new ways that we can relate to each other. that are going to be, and one other part of that relationship stuff is to be collaborative besides competitive. We grew up so much in a sea where we're swimming in competition, John, but we don't have to always be fighting. We can be seeing each other as brothers and collaborators besides competitors.
Yeah, beautifully put. And I love that you brought in that shoulder to shoulder versus face to face, that change in dynamic, because the work I do typically is and was face to face. Men struggle with that.
Yeah.
And so for some of my more difficult clients, usually, like teenagers back in the day, I would actually take them out to a park and do something with them side by side, so they wouldn't have to make eye contact.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think, when we were hunting back in tribes, that's how we were, was shoulder to shoulder.
I'm glad you mentioned the tribe stuff, because that's a piece of this puzzle that really animates me, John. And I'm not sure if you explored that with Alex in the other conversation I heard, but the idea that most of our time as human beings was as hunter-gatherers. So like our DNA is really, our natural makeup is shaped by 100,000 years roughly of being foragers. And those communities were shaped by three attitudes, or three kind of central attitudes, according to the research I've looked into on this: gratitude, gratitude, autonomy, and egalitarianism. And when men were in those communities, and when anthropologists have studied some of those tribes that have not been touched much by civilization as we know it, the men tend not to be super aggressive or dominating. They are much more living according to those things. We don't boss each other around, that we have autonomy. We aren't having extreme differences in wealth and status. And there's a sense of abundance. Like the earth did give enough back then. In some ways it still does, but with the rise of agriculture, you started having scarcity. You had the more dominating folks came to the top. In some ways, that's a simplistic view, but we can see there was a Garden of Eden back then for male and female relationships, and for men in general to be. It wasn't a nasty, brutish, and short life back then. The research has kind of busted that myth.
Oh, awesome. So let me ask you this, just on a personal level, on a vulnerability level. So how is
I'm sorry, I don't do that stuff, John.
I think you meant to say shit. I don't do that shit.
I know that shit, right.
So how has your personal evolution of masculinity gone? And where have you stumbled?
In a bumpy way, I would say. Hey, we're going to say something more there?
Just where have you stumbled?
I stumbled on tax day this week, John. I did my taxes with H&R Block. I've done for like 20 years. 80% of the time, 90% of the time, I've had a refund. Been pretty conservative. This year, I was a little more risky, and I have a $15,000 tax bill, which is at least 10,000 more than I expected. And it really, it hurts, and it hurts at these psychic levels too, about being a man who's a failure, a financial failure. Like, how come I'm not in control of our family finances as the main guy doing this stuff? And for a day or two, I just was like, really hit by that at that masculinity shame level. But thankfully, I've learned enough about this stuff, written about it, to like climb out of that spiral, sharing it with people, including my wife, and realizing, okay, it's not totally in my control. Like my son started college a week later than he should have. Well, if he had started college a week earlier, he would have been a dependent, maybe. That would have given us a big tax break. His school started in September as opposed to August, which some do. My youngest turned 17, and I didn't realize that cost you a $2,000 child tax credit. So there's these things that are just a little, it's complicated, it's complex. And if I looked at the bigger picture, we are in a society where my wife and her profession as an artist isn't recognized, isn't valued, but I don't subscribe to those values. Like, we would be in much better shape financially if she was compensated like, a VC, or investment banker or somebody. And look at down the street, the guys at Silicon Valley Bank just lost billions of dollars. And I should feel bad about a $15,000 tax payment. Yeah. So I'm working on writing about this too, from that perspective, which is also cathartic for me. So I would say, like, I'm making progress, and I still stumble regularly, in terms of navigating these old poles to feel the man box pressures, you could
Yeah,
say.
and thank you for sharing that. And it fascinates me because I think one of the man box rules is we're only as masculine as our latest achievement. So
Right.
as soon as we fall down, as soon as we get fired, as soon as we have a huge tax bill, as soon as I mean, there's a bunch of ways you can go. Someone breaks up with you, all of a sudden it gets related back in our minds to our masculinity. And I remember after I got divorced, I got a vasectomy, and I wanted it. Like I didn't want any more kids.
Yeah.
And there was like 12 to 24 hours afterwards where I had these thoughts in my head of, am I less of a man? Because
Right.
now I can't have babies.
Yeah.
Even though I didn't want any babies, in my
Right.
mind, I was too old for babies, but the
Yeah.
thought still comes. And so I make the distinction between first voice, second voice, where
Mm.
the first voice is just that primitive amygdala, emotional kind of troll, fucked up part of your mind, which is always there. And you can't
Uh-huh.
stop that. You can't stop that bastard from talking. But I would argue, the more true you, the core self, is that second voice. And
Yeah.
so to recognize
Yeah.
that as, oh, that's the first voice just talking shit to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then you come up with the second voice and say, you know what, John, relax. You're okay. You're still a man. You don't need that sperm anyway. You don't even want it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Do you know about that work of Phil Stutz and his tools? Phil Stutz, the
Oh
psychologist.
yeah, yeah. On the
You know,
he had the Netflix special.
the Netflix special.
Yeah, with
Really
Jonah Hill.
great stuff. Jonah Hill's
Yeah.
guy. I just was reading some of Stutz's book, and he's got this cool thing about shadow, which reminds me of what you're saying here, John, that if we can, he has this idea that if you can move your shadow out in front of you and have it look like a person,
Yeah.
like what are the features of that shadow, and then can you connect with it and speak out to the world with it. And I did that in the wake of this financial thing, and I was like, okay, that shadow looks like a naive, kind of disorganized, skinny guy, and weave in the strength piece in there. And there was, when I was able to kind of embrace that in the positive scene of it, it was like, there's something wise about the naivete I would have, like, which is to say, like, I don't care that much about money.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe in this the system we have in the ways it values certain professions way more than others that I consider more meaningful. So you're supposed to connect with the shadow and turn to some other audience and say, listen. And there's something kind of strong and powerful about doing that, or I found that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if there's a way to take some of those first voice impulses, even, or maybe it's not the same as what you're saying, but something about the thing that we are ashamed of and incorporating it into us that can make us healthier.
Well, I think that's largely what internal family systems is about, where, you take, like, I could also say that voice that's saying, oh, you're less of a man, is my inner critic. And so I can say that's a piece of me or a part of me. And I can have conversations with that part of me in an attempt to come to terms with it, make friends with it, have it be heard, and then ultimately have it switch roles, because that's a role it doesn't really want and never really asked for, but it took on in order to protect the whole of you.
Interesting. I just want to thank you for doing Inside Out, dude. What a killer movie. Can we have the little boys version next? Like, because in some ways that would be a really interesting segue.
Yeah.
That have you thought about that?
Well, I just had a small part in it. I just consulted and gave them information on anger and anger management and how the brain works in relation to it. But I did go back and do a little bit of work with Paul Ekman, who's the world's leading expert on emotion, and we were trying to get his Atlas of Emotions, which is an amazing tool that he developed for the Dalai Lama, into some of these. There's a few efforts going on to create social, emotional, and ethical curriculum for everyone in the world.
Yeah.
And I remember I talked to, I think it was Tulane, and they were super excited to have the tool and bring it in, but the whole conversation got scuttled because someone who was involved, their emotions came up, ironically, and I think they needed some more control, which I was confused by.
That does sound very
but we were going to use those inside out characters in that curriculum, and I was like, brilliant. Like, it's because that movie's given a whole generation of people a new vocabulary and a new awareness in terms of what's going on inside their head and their heart.
For sure. Yeah. I'm just thinking out loud. It would be interesting to show young men and older men what operates within us, because
I think it's a brilliant idea.
it's like a black box otherwise, and we don't want to look in it. But
Yeah.
the movie was such an invitation to explore this stuff.
Well, I think, honestly, I think most of us men are scared shitless to go inside.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles.
Because
It
some
is
of
scary.
what you start seeing is stuff that we're told is shameful, right? Like
Yeah.
fear and maybe
Sadness.
concerns were weak, or
Yeah.
sadness. I know I had a heart attack about 2 years ago, John, and one of the interesting things in the wake after I talked to a counselor for a while was like grieving part of my childhood and realizing that my dad's really bad temper had scared me pretty badly and had probably set the stage for some anxiety. And she said, you might have to grieve your childhood. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. It's like, holy crap. I have been walling off this sadness and shame around God, because you don't want to identify yourself as a scared kid, because what guy wants to acknowledge that he was scared?
I didn't want to identify as an anxious adult, but I went on the radio and did that ultimately. I was like, part of my makeup's depression, part of it's anxiety.
Well, kudos for doing that, because we still, and that stuff gives permission every time one of us does that, I think, to open the door open a little bit more.
And I think that's part of what gives me hope, is that there's more and more people out there that are giving other men permission to feel whatever it is they're feeling.
Yeah, I love it.
So let me ask you this, I got to wrap up, but where can people get a hold of you if they want to know more? Where can people get a hold of the book?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Ed Frauenheim. You can also go to edfrauenheim.com. My website, it's got some services there and more ways to connect. And you can find the book on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Happy to give talks, workshops on some of these topics. And I am really, this is a mission of mine to help guys free themselves and live fuller, healthier lives. And that usually means everyone around them has healthier, fuller lives as well.
Absolutely. Well, and I love you, and I really appreciate the hell out of the work you're doing. So thank you.
Love you back, man. Looking right in your face. Thank you so much, John.
Look into my good eye. So anyway, so that is it for this episode of The Evolved Caveman. If you like this episode, please be sure to rate, review, and share. If you didn't like it, you don't have to do a damn thing. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.